Hey, this is Andrew Austin of the FAR Podcast. This is the podcast vlog associated with the Freedom and Reason blog at andrewaustin.blog. There you'll find more than 400 essays, and that number is growing daily as I'm either putting up new material or I'm continuing to migrate from my old blog at Blogger. Google has some good services, but Blogger wasn't one of them. And so I'm using WordPress, and I've been moving not all of my old blogs. Some of you may be familiar with my old blog, same name, Freedom and Reason. I'm not moving everything over. I'm moving my lengthier pieces, my more thoughtful pieces. And sort of the new attitude I have on blogging is to not every day just blog multiple times, or to use it as a kind of Twitter. I'm on Twitter, but I don't really use Twitter. I never have used it very much. There's something about it that I don't like. There is a new Twitter alternative. It feels like it has more flexibility, called Parler. A lot of the social media I post on most is Facebook. I've been doing that for a very long time. And sometimes I'll write a lengthy comment or something on Facebook, and then that turns into a blog entry. I've been blogging a lot lately about the situation that we're in with the protests in the streets and the riots, the looting and arson, violence committed against people, and so forth. And I guess I should say to you, my professional background is I'm a sociologist, a criminologist. In particular, I look at political economy and criminal justice in the intersection. I have two specializations in sociology, political economy, and criminology, law and society, criminal justice under that rubric. And I deal a lot with prisons and police and looking at the class and race profiles, if you will, of those in different historical periods. My politics are very libertarian. For those of you who have been reading my blog or have seen, who've heard me talk before, know this. I'm very libertarian. I'm a Democrat, Republican. In the old style of thinking. I'm very much committed to the United States, and I'm coming to you. And by the United States, I mean the U.S. Republic, the idea that was the founding idea. So I'm a civil libertarian, and I'm coming to you today. This is July 4th, and I want to talk to you about the 4th of July, and I'm going to call this episode from one revolutionary to another. And I want to talk about Karl Marx because I'm also a Marxist, which often throws people when I tell people I'm a libertarian. I'm a libertarian Marxist or a Marxist libertarian. I don't like the term libertarian socialism or libertarian socialist because that's a term that Noam Chomsky uses a lot. And I'm not a big fan of Noam Chomsky. He also claims to be an anarchist, which seems to be doesn't seem to follow from the arguments that he makes. In any case, and so I want to do a couple things. So the first thing I'm going to show you the American flag, and you're going to see in front of the American flag here, Karl Marx. And it might strike you as odd to see Marx in front of the American flag, but I have to tell you that Karl Marx was a Republican, a small R Republican, a small D Democrat. He was a Democratic Republican. He was also a libertarian. If you read Marx's earliest stuff, you'll see that he was an atheist. He was very much a secularist. He was pushing for the freedom of the press and the freedom of speech, the freedom of people to speak their mind, the freedom of people to be free from religious strictures, from traditional structures, and so forth. So he was a devoted libertarian, and there's been some discussion. In fact, the main person, Louis Althusser, a French philosopher, a quite despicable figure, became very popular in the New Left movement, and he argued that there's a young Marx and a mature Marx. So he said there's this break that occurs in Marxism, and there really isn't. Marx's latter work is a committed scientific endeavor. In fact, I'm fond of saying that Marx is to social history what Darwin is to natural history, right? So in their domains, they establish sort of the foundational epistemological approach. It's a way to understand those things. And so Marx does mature like all scholars. What he does is he develops and refines this scientific approach that puts the meat on the bones of his libertarianism, of his democratic republicanism, of his commitment to humanism. And so there isn't a humanist Marx and a post-humanist Marx, or a humanist Marx and a structuralist Marx. It doesn't exist. There's a constant theme. Marx's values, his idea of the ruthless criticism of all things existing. He comes to this commitment very early in his life, and he never gives it up, and that's what informs him. And so he was a revolutionary communist, but he wasn't. It's not Marxism, Leninism. That's not his view. It's certainly not Maoism. It's not his view. He ruthlessly criticizes religion and culture and all these things to get an understanding, but he doesn't abandon the values of the Enlightenment. Free speech, secularism, humanism, all of these things. In fact, his work really embodies those values, and I want to talk to you about that today on July 4th, and because I really think it's important for people to not be confused about what we're hearing on the left today and what Marx represented in his day. So Marx his view is what's called the materialist conception of history, or sometimes called historical materialism. And he was very much in favor of progress. He was, and in fact, he spoke in glowing terms of the power of capitalism to create, technologies, and also the power of capitalism, the power of liberalism. And I'm talking about classical liberalism, to emancipate religion, emancipate business activities, and so forth, to emancipate them from traditional structures, emancipate them from the state. And so when we come to the New Left, which emerges in the 60s, it's critical theory that's coming out of certain directions in the Frankfurt School, what the right wingers call cultural Marxism, and according to a lot of leftists, that's a conspiracy theory. But I'm telling you, I spent a quarter century in higher education, in its upper levels, and that's very real. Herbert Marcuse is the worst offender. It's where Marx and Freud, who I value a lot, he brings in Heidegger, and there's this corruption that occurs. But it's not just the Frankfurt School, and I really do respect, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, Walter Benjamin, Franz Neumann, a lot of the Frankfurt School scholars. It's really this sort of latter direction. And then you have Mao Zedong thought, the Cultural Revolution in China in the latter 60s, and the students in the transatlantic community, both in Europe, particularly in France, and in the United States, start borrowing this. You see a lot of this on our streets today. If you want to know where this comes from, it comes from this synthesis that I'm describing. And then the other part, which was in part influenced by Mao Zedong thought, is French post-structuralism, postmodernism. And so that's the New Left. And out of that comes critical race theory, all of these very undemocratic, to be charitable, I would say anti-democratic, very authoritarian ways of thinking, identity politics, political correctness, all the things that are that are oppressing free thinkers in the modern society, and because of the authoritarian or totalitarian leanings in this way of thinking, then when Islam emerges, there's a fascination with Islam, right? They fetishize the exotic, and they admire it. Michel Foucault, the French post-structuralist, postmodernist. Of course, he rebelled. He didn't like being labeled in these ways. But in the late 1970s, he became just obsessed with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and praised it. And if you know anything about that revolution, you know that it's a terrible thing. And of course, and then the Cultural Revolution in China, which a lot of Chinese will tell you they lost a whole decade because of that insanity that happened. And that's happening in our streets. So that's the new left. And so the right wing and the conservatives say that's Marxism. They just say this is Marxism. And what as a Marxist, I disassociate myself with all of that. It's crazy. I don't see it as Marxism, and Marx wouldn't see it as Marx. I mean, Marxism. Marx had this. My understanding is that when some people were talking about kind of the interpretation people had of his ideas, he said he remarked, if that's Marxism, I'm not a Marxist, and I don't know, if he actually said that or whatever. I didn't know I was going to bring up that, so I would have checked. And I don't want to bore you by getting online and seeing if I can find it. But anyway, he would have said that. If he didn't say it, he would have, because I've spent decades studying Marxist thought, and there's so much value in it. It's such a powerful way of looking at the world. I mean, when you read the Communist Manifesto, and you understand at the time that he wrote that, and I wrote for a recent edition of the Communist Manifesto, I wrote the preface, and I pointed out what the conditions were at the time they wrote that, mid 19th century, and that given the level of capitalist development at the time, they're not writing about the current conditions when they're writing it. They're talking about what's unfolding. It's the book is prophetic, and of course, since it's not a religious book, it's a book that's based on a scientific understanding. What we really mean is that it has what we call predictive validity. That is the ability to predict. What does it predict? It predicts globalization. And in future podcasts, I'm going to really dig into this whole problem of globalization. I'm going to explain to you why it is that the corporatist globalist, why the authoritarianism of their system, the administrative state and corporate bureaucratic corporatism, etc., why that has so much in common with the bureaucratic collectivism, the socialism with Chinese characteristics of the Chinese Communist Party, which is now controlling so much of the world's supply chains, and why there's this convergence. And they really mean to do away with democracy. They don't need it anymore. And so what we're seeing is the development of a global neo-feudalism, corporate neo-feudalism. Okay, so here's what I want to do. I want to. So I'm not. Don't make any mistake. I'm not rehabilitating Marx's reputation. I don't need to. Marx can speak for himself. What I want to do is tell you about something that he did that most people don't know. They know about the Communist Manifesto and they know about capital, but they don't know about this. And so in 1865, Karl Marx penned a letter. This was the International Working Men's Association, and the occasion was Lincoln's re-election in the midst of civil war. And Karl Marx is writing this letter on behalf of the International Working Men's Association, of which he's a leader of, a member of, and one of the key leaders. And in this letter, which is sent to Abraham Lincoln, and so Abraham Lincoln is reelected, and this is a letter of congratulations on his reelection. And in that letter, Marx praises the United States, and I have some quotes here from the letter. as the idea of one great democratic republic. And of course, democratic and republic is capitalized, sort of a thing that you see in 19th century writing. And that's what our republic is. It's founded as a democratic republic. It's not founded as a democracy, an open democracy, the kind of, where, people get together and sort of hash out things in communities. Although that does exist. The wonderful thing about a republic, it's decentralized, it's a federated system. Wonderful about it is that you have all these thousands of engines of democracy. So you have communities where those things are worked out. But the overarching model, the national system, is democratic republicanism. So it's this idea of one great democratic republic, and Marx fully understands the character of the United States, how it is built, how it works. He praises the United States as the idea of one great democratic republic. Then he writes that America, and this is, I think, all in one big sentence that he writes this, and sort of prefacing what he wants to say, what he wants to get to. But these are sort of, let's admit, the character of the United States and why Marx admires it so much. Marx actually was among the many things he did. He was also a journalist and wrote wrote articles for newspapers in the United States. So he was known to Americans, and certainly in big cities. So then he says that America is the place where the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued. The first Declaration of the Rights of Man, not the French. He's not talking about the revolution in France, which is, I'm not going to go into that, but you study about it and it got out of hand. It got horrible. That's pretty scary stuff that happened. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the first Declaration of the Rights of Man is the United States. So what does he mean by that? Well, there's the Constitution, but in particular, he's talking about our great Bill of Rights, right? The right to free speech and free press, the right to assembly, to petition the government for redress of grievance, the right of persons to be free from arbitrary search and seizure, to be secure in their papers and effects, the right to remain silent. All of these things, Marx is aware of those, and he makes the argument. He makes arguments saying that these are the values that we should adopt. And when he defends press freedom and he defends free speech, he appeals in spirit to these values. By the way, this is why I'm a proud American. I love my country. And why do I love my country? Because the Bill of Rights is because of democratic republicanism, because of the Bill of Rights. So there is no contradiction between Marx's thought as Marx thought it, and the traditions, the secular humanist traditions of the United States. They're in line. We hear this narrative these days that the United States, is fundamentally racist, that because it was founded in racism and founded in slavery, as if the United States invented those things, right? United States emerged as a country with slavery already well established in the world, going back thousands of years. And it was the United States that emancipated slaves and actually set the example for the transatlantic community and the world. And so you would think that if Marx was one of these new kind of lefties who thinks that the United States should just go away, that it's a hopeless project because of the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow segregation, which of course Marx is writing before that happens. So he's looking at the chattel slavery, which, racialized chattel slavery, and he wrote quite a bit about it. He thought it was horrific, but he did not think that the United States was a hopeless project because of chattel slavery. Not at all. Marx was a world historian. He grasped the whole throw of history, and he understood that slavery was widespread in the world of his time and the world going back thousands of years. He knew slavery wasn't an invention of the West. Anybody who studies history knows that. He knows that, so therefore it's not unique to America. And he sees the Civil War, and this is the crucial part of this letter that he writes to Lincoln, as the work of a great nation overcoming an historic injustice mankind had long endured and still endures outside of the West. As some of you probably know, slavery still exists in the world. but it doesn't exist here. And so, to quote Marx, with abolition, a barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of civil war. He writes, from the commencement of the titanic American strife, since the beginning of the conflict, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. I want you to stop and think about that one for a minute. That the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. This flag behind me. That the working men of Europe looked to America. And as you would know, after the Civil War is ended, and you have, excuse me, I'm trying out a new, headphones are so clunky, and so I'm trying out these kind of using these headphones as in-ear monitors. They work great. I love them, but every once in a while one kind of pops out. So as you know, after the Civil War, you'd have this period of migration. A lot of the working men of Europe migrated to the United States. By a lot, I mean a whole lot, right? And we're going to get into that as well. And so European working men are looking at America as this great hope, and Marx recognized that, and they also saw in the conflict, that is, the Union preserving itself and transcending this dual mode of production. Now, I don't want to get too deep into the theory of this. Slavery, chattel slavery in the United States was capitalist production, but you had a Southern aristocracy, and slavery was the basis of almost a feudalistic pre-capitalist mode of production. And so they were also selling the products of the South, not just to the North in the United States, but they were selling them to industrialists in Europe. And so you had this interchange, and there was a conflict. It was a nation that was internally divided, not just because you had free states and slave states, but because you had, let's say to be specific, a different mode of exploitation, with wage labor being the dominant mode of exploitation in the North and slave labor being the dominant mode of exploitation in the South. And so there was this contradiction. And so overcoming that contradiction would mean that the United States would emerge as a more powerful industrial country. And given that the economic foundation would allow its ideals to be spread more fully, those ideals that, are in our rights of man, or in our Bill of Rights, that would have an even greater influence on the transatlantic situation. So America was seen by Europeans, and this is still true, as freer than Europe, and by the United States resolving this great contradiction within its own mode of production between these different modes of exploitation, that America would become more powerful and its great ideas would spread. This was the idea that Thomas Paine had. I mean, not at this level of analysis, but Thomas Paine recognized that American ideals were the superior ideals, and that we had the power to begin the world again. If you remember what he said, that our values would be the values that would go forth, shine forth in the world and transform human beings. That's why, with the influence of the United States, it's the West that gives rise to human rights. It's the West that gives rise to the organizations that try to keep the peace. Western civilization has contributed so much to the world, and the main reason for that is the spread of American values. So, from the commencement of the titanic American strife since the beginning of the conflict, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. A beautiful thing, a very powerful thing he's saying. Now, and of course, he's writing with the Communist Manifesto. He's writing with Frederick Engels. So I'm just going to talk about both of them as sort of one person when I do this. Marx told the worker movement in the world in the Communist Manifesto, and some quotes, that the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. I hear people say to me because I'm also a nationalist, I believe very much in American nationalism. And it's a civic nationalism. It's not an ethno-nationalism. It's a nationalism that's a multiracial nationalism. Bring all people together, assimilating them within the great spirit of this country. And boy, if we could focus on that, there's nothing that could stop us. And that I'm going to get into that because that's the problem that we face. But I hear people say, the sort of Marxist-Leninists will argue with me, and the Trotskyists, and those folks will say, but Andy, doesn't Marx say working men have no country? And yeah, that's a line in the Communist Manifesto, but you have to square that with the proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all, settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. Why? Well, to make the democratic republic more democratic, and they talk about how industrialization creates unionization, creates these political movements and proletarian consciousness, which is disrupted, by the way, by multiculturalism and racial divisions and all these things. And the capitalists know that. And that's what I'm going to get into. And so why are they talking about a nationalist struggle? Why are they talking about the proletariat of each country? So each proletariat has a country. So you have countries, you have proletariats in it, you have a bourgeoisie in it, they have and the struggle occurs there. Why? Because that's where the legal machinery is. That's where the state is. If you have power externalized to the nation states in a global system and it's run by transnational organizations and transnational power, then working people have no democratic Republican machinery to struggle for. And then they can use that machinery to transform society. I got to be honest with you. I'm just shocked that people don't get this. It's the most obvious thing in the world. And the reason they don't get it, I mean, I'm shocked that they don't get it. I understand why they get it. They don't get it because they're idealistic. It's sort of a dream world they're living in, and they think that globalization and multiculturalism are these wonderful things. That doesn't come out of Marx. You know, Marx is describing globalization as the developmental process of capitalism. But for political strategy, he's certainly not arguing that you could somehow unify the world proletariat without first having tangible machinery to project these ideas, right? These ideas, which ultimately transcend both proletariat, that's the working class, and bourgeois, that's the capitalist class, that both those divisions, right? Because humanism and secularism and liberalism and all that is transcending. Look, Marx is a liberal. He doesn't like capitalism. That's part of liberalism. But he feels they're in contradiction, that you can't fully realize the values of liberalism that we want to have, right? Free speech, free press, true free speech, free press, all those sorts of things, because you have this problem of private ownership of big capital, right? What does he say? The ideas of any age are the ideas of the ruling class. Why? Because the ruling class controls the material means of production. That allows them to control the intellectual means of production, right? So he understands the connection between who controls the economy, then who controls politics, who controls culture, right? And so if you want to more fully democratize society, you have to begin with more control over the Republican machinery of the modern nation state. Then when you have that control, you control law and policy, and then you can more fully democratize society. He was no globalist, Marx, in the sense he described globalization, theorized globalization. He wasn't a globalist. He didn't support that. He understood the importance of democratic Republican machinery. He understood the importance of the national economy to affect change for communities. And it's in the context of the capitalist nation state that the working class can move from being a class in itself, which you are, if you sell your labor to the capitalists, you are a class in yourself, moving from that to a class for itself. The capitalist class is a class for itself. That's why they're the ruling class. So Marx writes, quoting him, "The real fruit of their battles lies," and I'm pulling these quotes from various, the whole, the corpus of Marx's work, and this is a podcast, and I don't want to get academic on you. And so, if you're curious about the sources of these quotes, they're easy to find if you Google them. But I'd be happy if you write me. If you contact me through my blog, contact me through my YouTube channel. I'm happy to give you these sources. The real fruit of their battle lies not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of workers, right? And so you got to assimilate, get people together not have them torn apart by all these racial divisions. This is why the Civil War is such an important thing, because it gets rid of that, the contradictory modes of exploitation in the capitalist mode of production. It gets rid of that, but then it also gets rid of something that this division between the races. I'm going to talk about that as well. This union is helped by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry. That's why you need technology and industry, and that's why you need capitalism in its dynamic force. This places workers of different localities in contact with one another, right? So it means that workers in the South can communicate with workers in the West, can communicate with workers in the North, and so forth, and then internal to those regions. Marx recognizes that the machinations of the capitalist class in thwarting the worker movement, he recognizes the power of those and tells us to pay attention to it. He says the organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. So by setting up the competition, in a market, that's already pushing against the idea of solidarity. So you've got to build solidarity. You got to bring people together around that. But then if you have people organized into ethnicities and races and different religions and so forth, then the competition becomes more complex, right? You have these, you start seeing like this whole debate we're having today about, whites and blacks, and what do whites owe blacks, and all this is extraordinarily divisive, and it's set up as a competition. And the capitalist class, they're behind this, and they're laughing all the way to the bank. And it just drives me crazy that people on the left can't see the way they're being played. This is what Marx identifies as bourgeois nationalism, not proletariat nationalism, not populist nationalism. That's how I describe myself, as populist nationalist. Bourgeois nationalism. Bourgeois nationalism is the practice of fracturing the proletariat, the working class, fracturing them by dividing the people by ethnicity, race, and religion. Race is an artificial division, and it's constructed ideologically, and then it's used to divide people. So is religion, etc. So after liberating the business and culture and religion through the process of liberalism, the bourgeoisie, and particularly in its corporatist phase, what it wants to do is retribalize society in order to get control of the population by dividing them. Divide and conquer, right? Divide and rule. You've heard that before. So the move is obviously designed to disrupt the class consciousness that threatens to strengthen proletarian politics. It's very clear what's going on. Anybody can see that if you just stop and think about it. You should, at least everybody should see it. That's why I'm having this conversation with you. Hope I can help you see it. We see it today in the doctrine of multiculturalism, right? The importation of culture bearers, as Keenan Malik calls them, with different religious sensibilities and different, ethnic and cultural sensibilities, the selection of collaborators among them, what we used to call tokenism. Now this is diversity, where the corporate elite pull members of various identity groups. They groom and select certain members as representatives of identity groups, and they pull them in, and then this is a hegemonic operation, right? Then they can use that to then control. They can project a view that look how fair we are, right? Because our corporations have all these people from these different backgrounds. So therefore, see, that's why they don't talk about equality. They don't talk about individual equality anymore. They talk about equity, right? They talk about inclusion. They talk about diversity, right? That's the language they use. And that's a neoliberal strategy. That's not democracy. That's corporatism. That's bureaucratic corporatism. And so the education system is actually geared to grooming young people, preparing them to fulfill functionary roles in the corporate bureaucratic system. So the promotion of identity politics, and I've written a lot about this on my blog, so you can go check it out. You should. This is the child of cultural pluralism by many people. Horace Kellan is one of the most one of the leading members back in the early part of the 19th century. This is the whole progressive movement. Progressivism is the left wing, a left wing manifestation of corporate governance, right? So populism is the people, progressivism is the elites, right? And bureaucratic elites. And so this is the progressive cosmopolitan crowd, so writing in the pages of the progressive magazine The Nation in 1915, and this was in the interest of the industrialist. Callan deceitfully claimed that cultural relativism would provide for greater national unity, and of course, that it wasn't until the 1920s, with pressure from the working class, that immigration was closed off from Europe, and through a process then of assimilation and integration, you saw emerge a unified working class, and that was the greatest era of prosperity. It allowed us to fight and win World War II, and in the aftermath of that, to build the most prosperous civilization in history. That also, because unions and the power of labor to command higher wages, it also meant a fall in the rate of profit, and the capitalist class organized in the 1960s. This was Kennedy and Johnson's function in all this, was then to slash taxes on the rich, open the country up to mass immigration, lay the groundwork for offshoring, globalism and all of that. And I'm not going to go through that history, but this is the idea, and it's been primarily the idea of the Democratic Party that has just sold the workers out. And progressivism, multiculturalism, identity politics, their embrace of new leftism, what you see today, has really been a tactic of dividing the working class, co-opting a segment of the working class in order to control the population. So Marx grasped this tactic in a letter from London to Siegfried Meyer and August Voigt. This was in New York in 1870. So mass migration is really starting to pick up at this point. He observes that the English bourgeoisie, the English capitalists, sent Irish labor, and this Irish labor was made redundant by the rationalization of land use in Ireland, and some of you probably know about that story. But they take these redundant workers, this surplus population, and they send it to English labor markets to force down wages. They use it to lower the material and moral position of the English working class. They're actually using Irish the same way they use them in the United States and various other ethnic groups. So what were them? No, that's the ethnic definition of a nation, right? So you have a nation that can be the nation state, the Republican structure or some other, whatever the governmental structure, state structure, legal structure the nation is. But then you also have nation in an organic sense as being an ethnic group. And so this forces down the wages. It lowers the material and moral position of the English working class. Those are quotes, by the way, from Marx. And the effort was to divide the working class into, quotes again, hostile camps, English proletariats and Irish proletarians. So English proletarians and Irish proletarians are hostile camps. This is manufactured by the capitalists. In a confidential communication to Bakunin, Marx writes that the English working class feels national and religious antipathies for him, and he's referring to the Irish. And insofar as the English worker identifies with the ruling class, regards himself as a member, and falls into supporting English colonization in Ireland, he strengthens its power. In other words, this is why you're anti-imperialist. So you have to oppose English colonization in Ireland. Because what they're doing is they are creating this surplus population in Ireland by rationalizing land use, and then they're sending the redundant labor, right? They're sending the Irish then into the British working class to divide them. And so you have to oppose that. You can't identify with in this sense. This is like globalization on a regional level, right? It's the same process. It's the British capitalist colonizing Ireland. You don't support that. That's where that influx of workers are coming in who are going to undercut your labor, undercut the native-born labor. He says this antagonism is artificially kept alive and intensified by the press, the pulpit, the comic papers, in short, by all the means at the disposal of the ruling class. This antagonism is the secret of the impotence of the English working class despite its organization. Why is the English working class so weak? Because the capitalists can successfully use cheap foreign labor to divide and undermine them. It's the secret by which the capitalist class maintains its power. These are all quotes. And the latter is quite aware of it. So thus we have the ruling class consciously pursuing a strategy of divide and conquer. And I've shown this in my blog in numerous essays. It's not until the American working class won restrictions on mass immigration sharply reduced the proportion of foreign-born workers in population that we see a unified working class movement that won in many aspects before European countries. The rights of workers, we led the way in this. That's another blow that we struck for progress. Now, what happened in the mid-1960s? We had gone from some 14% of the population being foreign-born at the beginning of the 19th century. We decreased that to less than 5% of the population by the mid-1960s. Then they open up the country to mass immigration. Now we're back approaching levels of where we were at the beginning of the 19th century, where all the poverty and disorganization and chaos, etc. Now, what's been occurring now as a result of this? Wages, decoupled productivity from wages. Wages have been flat. Used to be the case that every generation new generation was going to earn more than the previous generation. That stopped. They're playing us against each other, and they're using these tactics of globalism. This is the political strategic aspect, the transnationalization of capital, of the law and policy, to wreck the working class, and it's been working. And so we made all this progress, and now we hear this narrative that there's no progress. America's hopeless. It's write it off. It's hope. All of, you blow up Mount Rushmore, right? Because Washington and Jefferson, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, these are horrible people because they lived in a world in which a lot of the horrible things that we all admit are horrible still existed. And so you don't look at the complexities of history, right? You just make these men out to be evil, and of course they're white. So and you have this whole argument that's emerged, right? All white people are racist. Only white people can be racist, and so forth. And the idea is just to create racial antagonisms so that the class antagonisms are hidden, and this disrupts class consciousness, the building of class consciousness. It disrupts worker solidarity. It's divide and rule. If people are taught to believe that the United States is no different today than when Jim Crow prevailed, or the brutality of the Gilded Age, or worse, no better than the days when blacks were chattel, then the interpretation of selectively presented facts shaped by that framing comes out wrong and potentially destructive. It's a false narrative. And I've been writing about Black Lives Matter and their role in perpetuating this false narrative. Privation may lead to lend this feeling energy, that is, poverty and unemployment, and with the COVID-19 thing and so many people being thrown out of work, a lot of this had to do with just sort of anger and frustration and fear, boiling over, may feed that. But it's really the interpretation of American history, the degradation of the American idea, America bashing. That's what's malignant here. Ideas matter. Karl Marx never said ideas didn't matter. You just have to connect them to the deeper process, which is what I've done here. So while the new left, progressives, identitarians, they've abandoned the cause of democracy and liberty, and they fly other flags, I will fly the flag that carries the destiny of my class, the working class. That's the Star-Spangled Banner. Our destiny lies through populist nationalism. And that's a populist nationalism that's organized around working class interest. Well, that's it for today's podcast. This is the FAR podcast associated with the Freedom and Reason blog at andrewaustin.blog. I want you to subscribe to both the podcast, vlog, and the blog. And please comment where you can. There's comment sections in those locations. Have a great 4th of July. I'm going to go. I'm kind of the guy who does the cooking because people like my burgers and stuff. And I'm going to go over to a friend's house. I'm not going to tell you her name because maybe she wouldn't want me to. But her birthday is the 4th of July. It's really great. And we have wonderful cake for her that will be both the birthday, celebrate the birthday of our country, our great country, the United States of America, and her birthday, this wonderful person. And so she'll know who I'm talking about. So happy birthday. All right, until next time, be courageous and think scientifically. Later.